Beatles' debut album sold 250,000 copies and spent 30 weeks at number 1 in the UK charts in 1963. So how come a regular stereo pressing, which you could have bought over the counter, be literally worth its weight in gold? I'm Andrew from Parlogram Auctions, and welcome to the story of the Beatles' rarest and most valuable UK vinyl album. If you were a Beatles fan in the UK back in 1963, Friday, March the 22nd was a very important day. For that was the day on which you could finally get your hands on the Beatles' first LP, and the copy you would have brought home from the shops that day would have looked exactly like this. Inside this heavy glossy cover would have been one of these black and gold labelled discs, and in mono only. And that was because the stereo pressing wouldn't be released until April the 26th, a full 6 weeks later. But that was academic for most teenage pop fans, because the chances were that they didn't have a stereo record player anyway. Back in early 1960s Britain, stereo, having only been around since 1958, was still a very niche market, inhabited mainly by affluent middle-aged men, maybe like your dad or you and me now. Stereo record collections would have consisted mainly of serious classical albums, or crooners, or even some of the more exotic themed light orchestral albums, something which Parlophone did very well. But what the stereo owners weren't buying was pop music. Teenagers couldn't really care less about the format, it was all about the music. Most had record players like this classic Dansette, which were mono only, and pop was strictly a singles game. Albums were an expensive luxury, which would only turn up on a birthday or at Christmas if you were lucky. In 1963, in the UK, an album cost £1, 12 shillings and sixpence, which is the equivalent of £35 or nearly $50 today, which then was a quarter of your average teenager's weekly wage. So the biggest sales were for singles, which although cheaper at 6 shillings and 8pence each, was still pricey when you think that's £7 or $10 today. And to think that $10 today will get you a monthly subscription to Spotify and access to 70 million songs. Despite not being their target market, EMI had begun to issue selected pop albums in stereo in late 1960. Both Cliff Richard and Parlophone's Adam Faith were amongst the first pop acts to get the full stereo treatment. But sales were minuscule, and the format continued to trail in mono's wake until 1967. As I mentioned before, the stereo pressing of Please Please Me didn't hit the shops until 6 weeks after the mono pressing, which makes it look like a bit of an afterthought. But this would be the one and only time that the mono and stereo pressings of a Beatles album were not released simultaneously. Even when after it was released, it wasn't easy to find. Many shops didn't stock stereo pop albums and would only do so on special order. Some even charged more for stereo. But if you did manage to track one down in that last week in April 1963, this is what you would have got. The black and gold label was similar to that of the mono pressing, but this was to be its final appearance on Parlophone. By early May, the more familiar black and yellow labels were being shipped out of the factory. So this gold stereo label would only have been available literally for a couple of weeks and were heavily outnumbered by its mono counterpart. Demand for the stereo pressing was so low, there are stories of EMI shipping leftover copies to mail-order catalogue companies. Unfortunately, I don't have access to the EMI archives, so I can't say exactly how many were sold. But using the details on the record itself, we can try and make an educated guess as to how many were pressed. The actual number of copies pressed of this album has been the subject of much discussion and debate over the years, but the disc itself holds a few clues. To understand them, we have to look more closely at how EMI manufactured records back then, and more specifically at the information in the record's runout or dead wax. As with all albums, there was a matrix number, i.e. the tape number from which the album was cut. In addition to that, there are two other important markings. Firstly, in the 9 o'clock position is the mother number, for which the earliest pressings would be the number 1. And opposite that, in the 3 o'clock position, is a letter showing which number stamper was used. In order to identify a stamper, EMI used a complicated system of letters from a code word, which was a contraction of the words Gramophone Limited. That was G, R, A, M, O, P, H, L, T, D. The first stamper was allocated the letter G, the letter R the second, and the third was A, and so on. So the first mother stamper code coupling would be 1G, followed by 1R, and then by 1A, etc. Now let's look at exactly how this particular album was pressed up in the factory. Usually, an EMI record press would be loaded up with side 1 and side 2 stampers, each marked with a 1G code. And this 1G coupling can be found on all other Beatles albums. But unusually, there's no 1G pressing of this album. Why not? All copies of this pressing were made on just 2 machines, and for some reason the first 1G stampers were split between them. Machine A got the 1G stamper for side 1, and the second 1R stamper for side 2, and machine B got the opposite, 1R for side 1 and 1G for side 2. To muddy the waters further, 2 slightly different label designs exist for this pressing. The first has Dick James Music publishing credits for tracks 1, 2, 6 and 7 on side 1, and 4 and 6 on side 2. The other variation has Northern Songs listed as the publishers for all but 2 of these songs. These Northern Songs labels occurred on later gold mono labels too, and are rarer on both the mono and stereo pressings. The question is, how many copies would be pressed from a single stamper? This too has been the subject of much discussion and rumour over the years. EMI factory workers have stated that it was possible for a stamper to be used for anything up to 3,000 to 5,000 pressings. So is the often quoted figure of 900 wrong? Although I don't have access to EMI's archive, I have looked at all the copies listed on PopPsych, which is a website which shows all the copies of this pressing which have been sold at auction on eBay over the past 18 years. There are around 300 copies listed there, but that doesn't include Buy It Now or of course the ones sold on other online platforms or privately, let alone all the ones that have been thrown away over the years. Anyway, the copies on PopPsych, which had their stamper information listed, shows that pressing duties were pretty evenly shared between the 2 machines. But the big question remains, how many were actually pressed? Well, 99% of all the copies I've seen have that 1G, 1R stamper combination. But further research has revealed the existence of a couple of copies which have 1A side 1 stampers. So does this mean that the 1G side 1 stamper on machine number 1 had worn out? If so, that would mean it had already pressed 3,000 to 5,000 copies. But alternatively, that G stamper could have become damaged. We don't know exactly. Based on the facts that this album was pressed on just 2 machines, and the timing of the label design changeover, the often quoted production figure of 900 may not be that wide of the mark. But without factory documentation, we'll never know for certain. Like the gold monos, these pressings were all housed in Ernest J. Day printed covers, with a large stereo front indicator and the photographer Angus McBain's credit positioned beneath the final S in Songs in the lower right-hand corner. Also, like the monos, these early stereo covers were used to house the first yellow and black label pressings, although it seems a good deal was sacrificed on the wall behind the band at a private performance at EMI House on April 5, 1963. That was the occasion the Beatles received their first silver discs for sales of 250,000 of the Please Please Me single. So we've established its rarity, but how does it sound? Well, for this money, it better be good. Over the years, I've collected most of the original Parlophone Gold label stereo pressings, and you can see them all in another video on this channel. They all sound amazing, and this first pressing of Please Please Me is no exception. The purity of the vinyl is superb, and it weighs in at a respectable 170 grams. EMI records at that point in time were legendary for their sound quality. But how does it sound compare to this 2012 pressing? Although the 2012 was cut from a digital source, Abbey Road engineers went to great lengths to make it sound authentic. So, how did they do? One of the major differences between these pressings is their volume. To illustrate that difference, I've recorded I Saw Her Standing There from both pressings on my computer at the same volume, so I can show you the waveforms of each. Here's the waveform of that track from this Gold label first pressing, and as you can see, everything looks very healthy. Nice, well-defined dynamic peaks and good across-the-board frequency response. As I switch to the 2012 pressing, the reduction in volume is clear to see. It was the practice in the 1960s to cut as loud as possible, which sometimes led to distortion when cutting. In fact, cutting engineer Harry Moss's boss, the wonderfully named Horace Hack, who was manager of transfer operations at Abbey Road in 1963, had rejected Harry's first master tape of Please Please Me because it had been too loud and, quote, not of sufficient quality. But because of today's better equipment and quieter vinyl, there's no need to max out the volume on the modern pressing, which is why they were cut at a lower volume. However, the volume of the cutting is one thing, EQ is another. After matching the volume of the recordings, we can see that the instrumental channel on top is thicker because it's been beefed up, mainly in the bass area. The volume of the vocals appears to have been reduced and slightly softened by reducing some of the mids in order to sweeten them up for the modern ear. And that's fine. Personally though, I prefer the sound of the original. There's just something magical about having the original first pressing on your turntable, which a newer one, however good, just can't replace. So how much is this copy really worth? Taking into consideration the market, and most importantly its near mint condition, I'd value this copy at $10,000 to $12,000. At the time of making this video, 1 ounce of gold is worth $1,792, and this disc weighs 170 grams, which is 6 ounces, and 6 ounces of gold is worth $10,752. So we really can say that this record is truly worth its weight in gold. I hope you enjoyed this detailed look at this amazing album. This particular copy, along with many other great sounding Beatles albums, are available on our website, parlogramauctions.com. If you'd like us to sell your rare Beatles vinyl for you, please get in touch via the website and we'd be happy to help you out. We've got lots more fascinating Beatles subjects coming up, but in the meantime, please hit the subscribe button and maybe consider becoming a channel member, which will get you early access to all our videos and exclusive member-only content, and helps me keep all of this going. But I'll say bye for now, and thanks for watching.